Hello everyone! In this lesson, we are going to work on opening and closing our search overlay. So in other words, when someone clicks on this search icon in the top right corner, we want to respond by opening up a full screen semi-transparent overlay with a text field where users can begin typing in what they're looking for. Now, in order to respond to the event of this icon getting clicked on, we will need to write JavaScript. But before we write that JavaScript, let's first write the HTML that will control what the overlay should look like. So check this out. Follow along with me. Over in our text editor, within our theme folder, I want you to open up footer.php. Let's scroll down to the very bottom, and right before the closing body tag and this WP footer line, right above that, let's create a brand new div, and let's give this div a class of search-overlay. Okay, and then within that div, just as a test, let's say hello123. Now, if we save that and refresh our website, we don't see anything. Whoops, here's our search JavaScript test from the previous lesson, but you'll notice that we don't see the hello123 anywhere towards the bottom of the page. And that's because I've written CSS that targets this class, and it will hide this div unless we give it another class of search overlay --active. So the overlay is hidden by default, and then if we add this class, it becomes visible. So as soon as we save this and refresh, now you can see this semi-transparent overlay, and we see hello123. So what we're going to do is let the search overlay be hidden by default, and then we can add this class to it dynamically with JavaScript. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Once someone clicks on this search icon in the top right, we can then use JavaScript to add this secondary class in real time. Okay, and then once someone has that full screen overlay visible, what if they want to close it to go back to the regular part of the page? Well, within the overlay, let's add a few things. Instead of hello123, let's add a text field where users can type in what they're searching for, and let's also add a large X icon that you can click on to close the overlay. So within this div, let's add another interior div, and let's give this div a class of search-overlay __ top. Okay, and then within that new div, let's create one more div with a class of container, and anything that lives within this div will be horizontally centered on the screen. Okay, and now within this container div, let's first create a text field where users can type what they're searching for. So input, and let's give it a type of text. And just for CSS styling, let's give it a class of search term. And why don't we give it a default value? So placeholder equals. So when you first see the field, it already reads, what are you looking for? And then while we're at it, why don't we also give this input an ID of search term, so that way later on we can have a unique hook to look for with our JavaScript. Okay, so if we go ahead and save this, that creates the full screen overlay with this top portion that's a slightly different color. We've got an input field, and if you click on it, you can start typing. Next, let's add a large search icon right about here. And let's add a large X or close icon right about here. So back in the text editor, right before the input, let's create an I element. Since we are using the Font Awesome library, this is how you can create an icon. Let's just give it a class of FA for Font Awesome, and then give it another class of FA-search. Okay, so that will pull in the Font Awesome magnifying search icon. And then let's give it another class that will give it the right color and also the right positioning. So let's say search overlay __ icon. And then whenever you create a Font Awesome icon, you also want to add another attribute instead of class named area hidden. And let's set that to equal true. So this way, if someone comes to our website and they don't have perfect vision and they are using a screen reader, it will not try to read this element out loud to that visitor. Let's go ahead and save that. Okay, cool. There's the large search icon. Now let's just add the X or close icon over here. We can actually just copy and paste this I element. So copy it into our clipboard. And then right below this input element, just paste in your clipboard. And instead of FA-search, let's change that to FA-window-close. And then let's change this class from search overlay __ icon to __ close. Let's give that a save. Cool. Now at the moment, if we click the close icon, nothing happens because all we've done so far is write a bit of boring HTML. But you can imagine that we want to use JavaScript so that when you click this close icon, we remove this active class from the search overlay so then it becomes invisible again. Okay, now at this point, now that we've got this basic HTML skeleton complete, let's go ahead and delete the active class, right? So the search will be invisible by default on page load. And right now, let's begin writing JavaScript to make the opening and closing of this dynamic. So in our theme folder, let's look inside the JS folder, and then the modules subfolder, and let's open up search.js. Now I want to begin by giving you an overview of how I approach object-oriented JavaScript. I like to break everything down into 3 main sections, or 3 main areas. So follow along with me and type this out. The constructor function is area number 1, so let's add a comment just to stay organized, right? Comments are just notes to ourselves that the computer won't actually run. So we'll say section number 1, the constructor is where we describe our object, or I should say describe and create or initiate. Don't worry, we will review what this means a bit later on. But the constructor is section number 1, and then right below the constructor function, I like to have area number 2, and this is where I list all of my different events. So an example of an event would be when this top right search icon gets clicked on, or when the search overlay's big X icon gets clicked on, right? Each of those would be an event, and we want to be able to respond to those events. Okay, and then section number 3 is where our methods will live. A method is just another way of saying a function or an action. It helps to think of our methods as verbs, right? Action words. So before we even write any real code, we can go ahead and write a few skeleton methods, right? Because we know that our search overlay needs to be able to open up and reveal itself, and it also needs to be able to close down or hide itself. So why don't we create one method or function named open overlay? Okay, and then right below that we could create another method named close overlay. Now we are creating a search object, but if you imagined we were creating a person object or a human being object, the actions that a human being can perform would live here, right? Things like run, jump, walk, speak. Okay, and to continue with that metaphor of creating a person or human being object, the constructor is where we would define things like the person's name or their eye color, right? So instead of this alert test message, in the constructor function, we could create different properties about the object. So we would say this to refer to the current object or person, and then we can go inside it with a period and then create whatever property names we want. So we could say name, this dot name equals Jane. And we could say this dot eye color equals green. And maybe this dot head equals some sort of object that creates a human head. And this dot brain, some sort of object that creates a human brain. Okay, so the constructor is where you create and describe and sort of give birth to your object. And then the events area is where you connect the dots between your object and the different actions that it can perform. So for an example of an event, I'm not going to write any real JavaScript, but let's just write pseudo fake code in plain English. We might say, on the event that this dot head feels cold, maybe we respond by running a method named where's hat. And then you could imagine that down here we would have a method named where's hat. So the events area is sort of like the dispatcher, or it's the main central office that takes an incoming event. Maybe if the head of someone feels cold, you respond by putting on a hat. Or another example would be on this dot brain feels hot. Maybe you respond by going swimming. Okay, and then that calls or dispatches our method named going swimming. Okay, now that's enough with our person or human metaphor. Let's get back to the real world, where what we want to do is respond to the event of this top right icon getting clicked on. So back in our code, let's delete all of this human person metaphor code. So I will delete the name, eye color, head, and brain in the constructor. And then we can also delete these two fake event lines. And let's delete the going swimming and where's a hat method. And let's begin up in the constructor by selecting this icon element. So back in our code, inside the constructor, let's create a property about this object. So let's say this dot, and then we can make up a property name. Let's call it open button equals, and then we just want to point towards this element. Now, selecting an element with JavaScript is simple enough, but we are actually going to leverage a library named jQuery to make it even easier. jQuery is no longer the cool kid on the block, so I wouldn't necessarily use jQuery on every single new project, but considering the nature of this fictional university website, I think jQuery is a decent fit and will save us a lot of extra coding in the long run. So back in our editor, if we want to use the jQuery library, what we can do is just up at the very, very top of this file, we can say import $ from single quotes jQuery. We want to use jQuery to select this top right search icon. So what we can do is $ to begin using jQuery, parentheses, quotes, and then we can just use a CSS-like selector to select the element, meaning a dot for a class or a hashtag for an ID. Now I can tell you that that top right icon has a class of JS-search-trigger. Let's drop down to a new line, and next let's select the close icon that exists in the search overlay. So this dot, we can name the property whatever we want. Let's call it close button. And then we want to select that close icon, so we can use jQuery to select an element. And I can tell you that the X icon has a class of search-overlay__close. Okay, and let's create one more property for now. Let's say this dot search overlay, right? Let's select the actual div that we want to add and remove the active class to hide and show the div that we added to our footer at the beginning of this lesson. So jQuery to select it, and it has a class of search-overlay. All right, now at this point we've got all of the different properties that we need. Now let's go ahead and connect the dots between these elements, the events of them getting clicked on, and then the appropriate methods that we want to respond with. So in our events section, let's create a method named events. So events, parentheses, curly brackets. And within these curly brackets, we want to be on the lookout for two events. The first is when the open button element gets clicked on, and the second event is when the close button gets clicked. So let's start with the open button first. So we can say this dot open button, right? That will select the element that we have stored in this property. And then we can just say dot on, and then the jQuery on method takes two arguments. The first argument is the event that we want to be on the lookout for. In this case, it's the click event. And then the second argument is the name of the function or method that you want to call in response. So when this button gets clicked, we want to fire our openOverlay method. So to point towards this method, we just say this to refer to the object, and then dot, and then the name of the method. So openOverlay. Now before we write the actual code for these methods, let's just go ahead and write the other event line for the close button. So new line, let's say this dot close button, and on the event that it gets clicked on, what do we want to do? We want to fire our close overlay method. So this dot close overlay. All right, now that we've spelled out those two events, let's actually write the code that adds and removes the active class to the search overlay div. So in our openOverlay method, let's begin by targeting our main search overlay div. So this dot search overlay, and we just want to add a class to it. So add class is a jQuery method or function, and then we just provide the name of the class. So remember, it's search-overlay --active, and then for the close overlay method, we can just do the same thing but reverse it. So let's copy and paste this line, copy it, paste it into close overlay, except this time we don't want to add a class, we want to remove a class. So just change this jQuery method name to remove class. All right, now before we save this and test it out, there's only one last thing we need to do. We want the web browser to be on the lookout for these events as soon as the page is loaded, or in other words, as soon as our object is created or born. So within the constructor, let's just call the events method. So we can just say this dot events, parentheses to actually call the method or function, and that will make sure that these event listeners get added to the page right away. Okay, now at this point, let's save this file. And then if you go back to your browser, now if we click on this icon in the top right, whoops, that's actually not working yet. I know what the problem is. Back in our text editor, in our events section, by default, the jQuery on method, when it calls the method name that we list here, it's going to change the value of the JavaScript keyword this. So then in our open and close overlay methods, when we are saying this dot search overlay to try to target that main div, we think the keyword this is referencing our main object, right? The object that contains these properties. But the on method changes the value of the this keyword to point towards the HTML element that got clicked on. So what we can do to solve this confusion is right after we list the name of the method that we want to call, we can just say dot bind, which is a function, and then just include this as the value. So dot bind this. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So now when I click the top right search icon, cool, and if I click the close icon, perfect. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will keep on rolling with the JavaScript.